Welcome back, everyone. So now we're going to talk a little bit about checking in with your mental health and looking at this from a kind of practical lens of what kind of questions can you ask yourself to really understand just where your mental health is at in a given moment. So Stephen, what kind of questions can we ask ourselves to kind of understand where we're at in a given moment, right? Like, we can get quite caught up and busy in the busyness of the day and kind of go throughout a day without even realizing where our headspace is at.
Yeah.
How do we pause and check in with ourselves?
Yeah, good question. I sometimes like to think of it as just as a starting place of kind of a chain of like thoughts lead to certain emotions, and then those emotions lead to behaviors, the classic way we talk about it, but also they lead to different sensations, like the way we experience those in our body somatically. So sometimes just to start with that place of having that awareness, because I think there's probably a lot of people that don't. I think we've gotten this has changed over the past few years. I think there's a lot more awareness around, because of yoga and because of whatever. There's lots of different talk out there, and social media will talk about, our bodies a little bit more. But I think we still tend to be very heady creatures. I think we tend to like to just think like, can I articulate this? Can I understand this? And I think it's trying to look at it more holistically, like that we are, the way we think does impact the emotions that we have, and we do carry that in our bodies really physically, and that emotions are not, often we'll talk about them as like positive and negative emotions, and I think I like to try to reframe that as, there's comfortable emotions, which sounds kind of funny to say that, but and then there's uncomfortable emotions, and they might feel really negative, but also sometimes they're actually, I think we need to feel them. Like sometimes it's important that we feel what's going on inside of us and make sense of that. And if we always are distracting and pushing those feelings away, or another way of putting this is I think we spend a lot of our days doing everything we can to avoid feeling anything uncomfortable. And so like for me, I always like to have some music on in the background, or it's easy to like watch Netflix as a distraction, or it's even sometimes like you go for a walk, but I might listen to a podcast and I'm like, hey, why do I need to do all of that stuff at the same time? Like maybe I can learn to kind of tolerate that my brain isn't worrying away at something or thinking about a podcast or listening to music, but I'm just able to kind of be present here, in this moment as I do something like cooking dinner or, going for a walk or, So that's maybe a starting place, which isn't answering that question yet, but that being aware of that we're holistic and that there's more than just the thinking part.
Well, and I think it's becoming increasingly difficult to just be present with being uncomfortable, even with just like phones and social media and everything.
I didn't even mention the phones. Of course, yeah.
I mean, I feel like if when I walk into grocery stores or something, you see people in the lineup, and rather than just being present and looking around at what's happening around them, everyone's on Facebook until it's their turn or something like that. And I know I do that myself. Like I'll just default to, grabbing a phone or doing something and like filling those spaces in your day so that when you're in the midst of all the stress and busyness, rather than pausing and feeling it, you just kind of numb it out and bridge to the next thing or something.
Yeah, and kind of what do we lose by always having something in our hand, or always being distracted, or always having some other person's idea in our brain, but not actually spending time kind of being curious and understanding what we're experiencing. So So as far as questions then, like the classic one just would be like, how am I feeling today? Like that's a weird question, but a lot of people don't really ask themselves, how am I feeling?
Yeah.
You'll get in your car and drive to work or whatever it is you do. And for me, it's like I work from home most of the time. So for me, it's even just racing around doing my normal routine and then sitting down at my desk like 30 seconds before my day starts, but not really having tuned in at all to like, what am I feeling? So that question can be important. And more profound than we think it can be. Some of those questions around what is it that energizes us, what is it that we find life-giving, and then the opposite is what are the things that we maybe find draining, and we can't avoid doing things that drain us. Sometimes it's just part of life, but if we can kind of be aware of that and not just kind of go on autopilot, but recognize like, okay, so what are these things that I really do find good and easy and fun, and also like, the phone stuff. And I don't very often meet people that say that they feel energized after being on Facebook. I just don't think that most people do. I think people feel a little bit drained. They might have read something that they disagreed with, and then they're spending time, thinking about that, or so I think there's lots to that too, right? But that question again it can be more profound than just that quick, like, oh, I like this and I don't like this. It's like, what are some understandings of why? Another way of putting that what are things that bring contentment or satisfaction? The word joy, what brings that might be like that's a big word that I'm not sure people necessarily feel that often. But it's great if we have moments of that. But I think contentment and satisfaction might be sometimes, because again, that word happiness, I think that word kind of gets thrown around a little bit. And I like, we can't be happy all the time. I don't think that pursuing happiness is like necessarily a great thing to pursue. It's great to enjoy and notice when we're happy, but also if that's what we're seeking, I think that's a different thing. Noticing what's changed over time around those things. Like, have I know as I'm in my mid-40s now, that's what I find relaxing and enjoyable is probably different than it was 10 years ago. So just noticing some of those things too. Noticing things that we're afraid of. What are my fears can be a really helpful question. That can be like, am I afraid of failing? Am I afraid? A lot of people have this idea of, and it came, I think, after the pandemic, people have been thinking more about the passage of time. People feel like they lost 4 or 5 years, even if maybe they didn't, but it can feel like that sense of, and depending on what life stage you were at during that period in history, like that's, there's been some loss there. There's been some new fears maybe unlocked for people that they need to kind of spend some time making sense of. And then the other side of that, though, is what are we hopeful for? What are some things? And I think that can be a nice reframe sometimes of like, there's been some loss, and that we need to acknowledge that and grieve that. Also, what are the things that we really hope is painful, hope's hard, because it's like it's an anticipation, and it's generally positive, but also it's hard to hope for something because it's like, what if it doesn't happen? Like,
hope in and of itself can be kind of scary.
Hope is kind of sort of feels a little bit like anxiety sometimes. So
that's very true.
We throw that word around a lot, and we write it on signs and put it on our walls, but I think it's a loaded word. That idea of can we be our true selves is also another, and again, that gets thrown around, like be your authentic self. And I think that it's hard to define what that is. Like, is it what we do? Is it what we think? Is it what we believe? Is it who we spend time with? But if we can kind of try to sort out a little bit of what does that mean to be our true selves, sometimes it's like, the idea of relational selves, like we experience ourselves a little bit differently with every person that we know.
That's interesting, yeah.
And so there's going to be some people I don't actually like the version of myself that maybe comes out as much when I'm with them. Like, I feel like I'm either, maybe there's a sense of like protection or being threatened or feeling like not as good as them, or there's different, or being judged. Whereas there might be some people where I feel so free and I can be like ridiculous. I can say whatever I want, and I know that they're not going to judge me, and I know they'll know that I'm not doing that that's coming from a place of trying to be honest. It's not coming out of a place of trying to be hurtful. And so when we have some, and we can't do that with everybody. Like, it's just not realistic that we can be our authentic self. It's not safe to be our authentic self with everybody. As leaders, I don't think that leaders can, or even, and if there's expectation they should be themselves with everybody, I think that needs to be examined really seriously sometimes, because I think it's an unrealistic expectation, and it can lead to putting ourselves in positions where we might get hurt, because not everybody will have those expectations that we can do that, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And how can leaders find a balance between being true to who they are and their beliefs and their values and the things that are important to them, while also making sure that they have healthy boundaries as a leader in positions where it might not be appropriate to be fully vulnerable?
I think it's partly like, what's the role that we have? And I think if we see our role to just be an open book to everybody, I think that's probably a problem. Like, I don't think we can be an open book to everybody. We're going to have our thinking will evolve over time. I think it has to if we're like somebody that's like a human being that's wrestling with things in the world. And there's probably an idea of empathetic living. Like, I think if we, especially as leaders, people look up to leaders to be people that are assisting people in thinking things through and creating a space for people to wrestle. Also, just like the idea of like creating a place for people to just worship and creating a place for people to feel safe. And so I think, you know, sometimes we set boundaries to protect ourselves, but also sometimes we're kind of protecting other people. Like, I think we don't, it's not empathetic to just always push people and prod people in ways that might not be comfortable. So I'm not sure if that's making sense or not. But
yeah, I think that's a really excellent point too. I think we often think of boundaries as something for ourselves when we're putting boundaries in place in relationships, but they might also be for the benefit of the other person, that you know, me being vulnerable might not lead to an appropriate dynamic in this sort of setting.
Not everybody, what was I going to say? We can't be everything to everybody. Like, it's not possible.
Yeah.
And so if we're trying to do that, we're going to probably fail, or we're going to feel like misunderstood, or the people are going to be upset. And so it's trying to do that in a loving way, but also an honest way. It doesn't mean that you're being deceptive or that you're hiding things. It's just our parts of ourselves. It's that we are entitled to privacy. We're entitled to have an inner circle of people that we trust. And there are some people that, if you know, that we can't always, they will actually act in ways that sometimes can hurt us. And that's okay. Like, they're not, I think people are doing the best they can. But I think some people, we need to kind of be cautious, and that's okay to protect ourselves a little bit. I think anybody that's been in leadership for a while probably resonates, but
definitely.
But I think it's important to say that and give people permission that's actually realistic and okay.
Well, and that can be such a big thing too. Just hearing someone else voice it as permission to do it is sometimes all you need to just kind of like accept and be like, okay, it's okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and you raised a lot of great questions that we can kind of stop and ask ourselves. In the busyness of day-to-day life, especially as church leaders or such, it can be easy to never ask yourself those questions. How in day-to-day life can we make time to stop and ask those questions? Is that a matter of working it into your routine in a structured time, like putting that in your calendar? Or are there ways to build habits in everyday life that kind of create more reflection?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that it can be done, some people are just naturally going to be more kind of introspective, self-reflective people, and I don't think it's bad or good. I think it's just we're wired in different ways, and also we might have, some people maybe grew up in homes or situations where that was invited and maybe vulnerability was permitted, and so that those people might feel more safe to share some of that stuff or talk about that with people. There are a lot of people too, though, that it's their experience was they didn't maybe grow up in a home where there was space for big emotions, and you know, maybe even the idea of anger was seen as something that was inappropriate or something that needed to be, and rather than looking at, there's the idea of the iceberg of anger, where there's the 10% of the iceberg that sticks out of the water is like anger, and then not recognizing that below that there's all sorts of other more vulnerable feelings of like feeling shame, feeling embarrassment, feeling hurt, feeling lonely, feeling depressed, feeling disappointed, so there's lots of stuff, and they're not all negative either, or uncomfortable, but there's other, and so I think if we can start to understand and pull apart those feelings a little bit, then it can feel safer for people to express those and think about that. But yeah, I think there needs to be some intentional way to do it, probably. For some people that is prayer. They'll have that daily practice. I think there are some types of prayer or some ways of praying maybe that, and I'm not judging how people pray, but I think, I know I can think back to different ways I was taught to pray when I was younger, and some of them probably didn't feel that, I'm going to say authentic, but didn't feel like it invited that much honesty. It was almost like we needed to curate a version of ourselves, or I'll speak for myself. I had to curate a version of myself that was acceptable to God. And I think as I got older, I recognized that God sees all that stuff anyway, and trying to just say like, this is me, lay it bare, and you see that in Scripture too. Like there's moments where people do pray like that, but Sometimes that's one part of it. Is like if we can really honestly kind of make space and bring some of those harder emotions to God that might not feel appropriate, things we might not say out loud to anybody even, but if it's jealousy, if it's feeling threatened, if it's feeling angry, if it's feeling disappointed or resentful of people, like those are all sometimes okay to bring. And there's good stuff too, but I'm focusing on the hard stuff because that's what we talk about. So that's one. Journaling, I think for some people is another way to do that. Making space that way. Sometimes just doing some basic, if you can practice that self-talk over time, like how am I doing today? Some people access emotions from a very intellectual place. And if they can kind of understand them, then that helps them to feel them and make sense of them. Some people, I think, struggle to do that, and they almost find it easier to access emotions based on what's going on in their body. So, they might just feel tight, they might feel muscle tension, they might feel, we all carry tension in different ways in our jaw or stomach, shoulders. And if we can kind of notice sometimes that stuff's happening, that's another way to tune in and be like, oh, it feels like there's kind of a clog or a block going on here. I need to maybe make some sense of what's happening. So again, it kind of comes back to awareness probably too, to do those practices.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a couple, you hit on some great stuff there. First of all, you've spoken to the importance of vulnerability, and I really like the idea of, being conscious about the role that vulnerability plays in our spiritual health and in our relationship with God. You talked about how vulnerability can be a bit of an antidote to shame. And this idea of bringing vulnerability into your spiritual life and authenticity, I think, is really, really important and something that we might not speak of in such direct language usually. Yeah. I think that's really important. Also, you talked about the idea of anger behaviors, kind of being that tip of the iceberg, and then there's a lot more happening underneath there. I think that alludes to something that's really important, is that our behaviors are often kind of allude to what's happening underneath a little bit that we might be less aware of. How can we access how we're feeling through analyzing how we're behaving? If you are having more outbursts of anger, rather than just writing that off of like, well, I was put in a bad situation and that anyone would have reacted that way. How can you kind of go below it and try and figure out what's happening below the surface that's making me behave this way?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure I'm going to have a nice, neat answer for you, but I like
that's
the
okay.
question.
Scattered question or answers okay too.
I think it's definitely possible that on personal reflection we can understand some of those, but I do, and as we get older, I think we do see some of those patterns in different ways maybe. Like we can look back and understand. Again, I liked that question of what is the good intention or the positive function of our emotions? Like, is it protecting us? And if so, what am I protecting myself from? What am I feeling? If I'm getting angry all the time when I'm around this person or when I'm in this meeting or something, what is it? Am I being heard? Am I being listened to? Are there expectations being put on me that don't fit with my own needs or what I feel like I can do? Some of those can be helpful. I also think that sometimes it can help to have another, like speaking with someone else, whether that is a therapist or whether that's someone else, just to kind of start piecing together, maybe what the role of, say, anger has been like in someone's life in general. When does anger tend to come out and what are those patterns? And again, kind of looking for some of those themes, sometimes examining the beliefs that we operate by, like a couple that I wrote down that I was just thinking was that idea that I must make everyone happy. That kind of, that's a big belief that a lot of people have, right? And I still have people that will say like, well, I really believe that, like I can't not make people happy, or I can't disappoint people. And that idea, like, we actually, it's essential that we learn to disappoint people. Like that's not possible because you're going to have two people that have different needs and you're going to have to disappoint someone. The other idea of like, I can't not be okay. Like we often have that sense of like everybody else is allowed to maybe not be okay sometimes, but I have to be like the last bastion here. I have to be the person that is okay. And I think recognizing like there's times, I know that there's, it's the name of a book and it's a common thing, like it's okay to not be okay. But I think there's times when we just need to recognize that and make space for that and kind of regroup and rest and understand more. So
yeah, absolutely. And you've talked a lot about uncomfortable emotions, and I think often our instinct to feeling uncomfortable, like you were saying, is to kind of make that feeling go away, whether that's through reaching for your phone or coping behaviors, substance use or such, but trying to address discomfort by making it go away. How can we learn to be comfortable being uncomfortable, or to just observe what we're feeling without trying to put labels on it as this is good, this is bad?
That is, I think, one of the essential skills that I work on with people and still work on with myself. Like, out of dialectical behavior therapy, there's often one of the skills is like distress tolerance. It's learning how to tolerate being in distress, or that word, we don't usually use the word distress, but just learning to be uncomfortable, learning to tolerate, feeling lonely, learning to tolerate feeling not good enough, or feeling, there's often this dichotomy of I feel like I'm too much for everybody, or I feel like I'm just not enough for anybody. That's a common kind of language that I use with clients. And I think so there's never a nice neat answer for that. I think it's also, I've done a lot of work in the addictions and substance use world in the past. And I think that's a key for that too, is like this sense of trying to kind of avoid, numb out, or just not feel uncomfortable. And I think a lot of that does come down to like physically, how do we carry those emotions in our body? Like when we're lonely, it's a weird question for someone, but if you say like, how does it feel? Like, how does it feel when you're lonely? How does that feel in your body?
It's a great question, because I don't think I've thought of that many times before. And
you might not be able to answer right now.
Yeah, I'm not feeling lonely in this particular moment, so I also have to kind of go back mentally. But I don't know, maybe there's a sort of almost emptiness to it in a way, of like some sort of, like something's absent in a way, or not feeling complete or not feeling whole. I think it's an uncomfortable feeling, something that can have an undertone like anxiety, but maybe not quite anxiety, but something that feels disrupted.
So that you're doing a great job of trying to
Thank you.
But that's sometimes what we're doing, is trying to figure out what that is. We're sitting there, we wake up in the morning and we're lying in bed, and for some people it seems like there's different times of the day. Some people struggle with certain things. Like some people it's mornings, they wake up and it's really hard to get going. Some people it's nighttime, that they just end up staying up late. There's like that bedtime revenge thing where people stay up because it's the only time of the entire day that they have a little bit of time that they are in control of. And so they'll stay up till 1 a.m, like watching Netflix or on their phone or something, just because that's the way. But there's also this sense of some sort of like, it's almost starts feeling like an existential dread or threat or whatever you want to call it. But there's these feelings. So a lot of the work is learning to identify what that feels like, and then kind of saying, okay, like, can I build up a bit of a tolerance to this? Can I also, if we just always push it away, then we're not learning how to actually understand it and be curious about it. It's actually not, it feels horrible to be lonely, but being lonely itself is not actually good or bad. Like it means that we don't maybe have, it can spur us on to actually try to meet people, or it can spur us to reach out to the people that maybe we could reach out to, but there's things that prevent us. So I'm just using that as an example. But yeah, I think it's trying to kind of notice on a body level how we experience that, notice our thinking around that too, because we can get into those negative thought loops of like, nobody likes me, or I'm just not good enough for people, or people, I value others more than they value me, like some of those really core thoughts that we end up having, or nobody appreciates me, and trying to temper that back and say, okay, like sometimes we'll call it opposite action, again, from dialectical behavior therapy, is like, what can I do to kind of defy those thoughts? What can I do to defy this feeling I have in my body, defy in a good way, and maybe do some opposite action, whether that, it might be pushing ourselves, it might be meeting new people, it might be, joining one of those meetups where people exercise. If you don't know anybody that does that stuff, like it's that, then you start to get a lot more creative, and that branches out to lots of different types of solutions and things. Right. But the first start is to try to actually understand that. For a lot of people, if you just say, can you sit for some people now, they can't actually watch a show without also scrolling. Like it's gotten to the point where they have to do both.
Right.
Myself included sometimes. So it's sometimes that sense of learning, like, and so you go to like reading a book, like for some people they've lost that cognitive patience to be able to sit and just read. So that's some examples maybe of trying to build up a tolerance with those uncomfortable emotions.
Yeah, definitely. Like stopping to recognize what you're feeling, and then rather than trying to, get rid of the feeling, build a bit of a tolerance around it, or even use it as a motivation for healthy solutions. Like you were saying, loneliness inspiring you towards like, okay, a healthy solution to this is, getting out and meeting new people, or putting myself in social situations, where I can build community or such.
Yeah. Rather than getting bogged in the shame. Another way of putting it is like understanding those feelings and trying to maybe befriend your inner experience. Like that's again a funny way of putting it, but it sort of actually makes sense. Like I need to kind of be kind to myself and understand what this is, rather than just like, oh, this is horrible and I'm just going to avoid it and just shut down, and time flies, and like you can scroll on your phone every day for 3 hours or 4 hours.
Oh, easily, yes.
And there's a week that goes by, so it's trying. And I think a lot of people are feeling that sense that time's going fast, and trying to shift some of those patterns. But I think that's the root of a lot of those patterns, actually, and we don't talk about that very much because it's hard to put into words.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, that's excellent. Well, and what we're talking about next is going to connect directly to this. It's this idea of mindfulness as kind of a tool to help ground ourselves, and I'll let the experts speak to the details of that. But we'll be back with that one shortly. Yeah, thank you.